Hi everyone, a very good afternoon. Welcome to today's seminar titled Imran Khan's Fall, Maybe a New Beginning, Pakistan's Ongoing Tryst with Populism. This joint event is organized by the Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore, and the South Asian Studies Program, SASP, NUS. Today we're delighted to have with us Dr. Asim Sajjad Akhtar, Associate Professor, Tehreek-e-Azam University, Islamabad, and non-resident fellow ISIS. Dr. Asim Sajjad will be discussing the recent political developments that have taken place in Pakistan and the impact it's set to have on the state's future. Today's discussion will be chaired by Dr. Rajshri Jetli, visiting fellow SASP, Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, NUS. Before we proceed with the event, I'd like to inform everyone that this event is being live-streamed on ISA's Facebook page. I'll now invite Dr. Rajshri to make the opening remarks. Dr. Rajshri, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome to this joint seminar hosted by the Institute of South Asian Studies and the South Asian Studies Program. I'm delighted to have been asked to chair this session because in some ways I've been connected with both the institutions. I've sort of worked here before, and now, of course, I'm with the South Asian Studies Program. Also very happy to see so many people here because after COVID, we've sort of hardly have had any events where people have sort of come together physically, and also nice to be able to see some old friends. So before I move on to the happier task of introducing our speaker, let me just attend to some housekeeping rules, which is that you'll speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for question and answers. So if you can introduce yourselves, and then perhaps you can ask your question, or if you have a comment, you can share it. Now, let me then introduce our speaker, whom I'm sure some of you would be familiar with. Dr. Asim Sajjad Akhtar is currently an associate professor of political economy at the Quaid-e-Azam University in Islamabad. He's also taught earlier at the Lahore University of Management Sciences. He holds degrees from the London School of, from the Northwestern University, the Yale University, and SOAS. Has also contributed regularly to the media on matters within his expertise. So he's written for Dawn, has also written for the Straits Times. He's widely published with articles appearing in several peer-reviewed journals like Third World Quarterly, Journal of Contemporary Asia, and Critical Asian Studies. And he's also the author of 4 books, and I believe most recent is The Struggle for Hegemony in Pakistan, Fear, Desire, and Revolutionary Horizons. So a very catchy title that is, I believe, just come out, right? Fresh off the oven. The title of his presentation today is Imran Khan's Fall, Maybe a New Beginning, Pakistan's Ongoing Tryst with Populism. Populist politics is something that we do see around the world, so I'm sure Dr. Akhtar will have some interesting insights into this from the Pakistani experience. It'll also be interesting to see the aftermath or the impact of the recent developments in Pakistan on the domestic politics, be it the coalition politics that we see today, or the relations between the army and the civilian leadership. Regionally, any instability in Pakistan will always have, in some ways, spillover effects on international politics, especially in the neighborhood, be it China, India, Afghanistan. But one thing is for sure, that South Asian politics, there's never a dull moment. But today, let's just stick to Pakistan, and to tell us more about it and take us through the events that have transpired since last month, I'd like to now welcome Dr. Akhtar to present his paper. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. And thank you all for being here. Thank you to friends at ISAS for arranging this discussion. I got here and I found out that this is the first time everybody's gathering in a long time. So someone facetiously noted that thanks to Imran Khan, we're all getting to sit in a room together and chat. So there's lots I'd like to share with you. In a sense, what I'm going to do is, through the lens of what's just transpired in the last few weeks, give you an overview of of this book that was just mentioned, that I've just written, which I have a copy to show you. I cannot give it to you, however, because I only have very few myself, but you can get a hold of it off of the Pluto website, or eventually, sooner rather than later, I'm sure it'll make it to bookstores. It so happened when I wrote it and I sent it to the press, the ex-prime minister was still in power. He's, of course, since been booted from power. But the contents, or sort of in some ways what I've argued, is very much, I think, still at least something for us to all debate. And in a sense, what I want to do today is place the Imran Khan phenomenon, as it were, within a broader comparative framework, because I do think there's something bigger at play here. Of course, Pakistan has its peculiarities, not least of all being a country, as some people say, unlike every other country in the world where countries have armies. Here an army has a country, so that does mean that it stands out. But I am of the opinion, and that's sort of what this book is also argued, that a lot of other countries, particularly in South Asia, are converging towards the Pakistan experience, in a sense. And so I'll sort of make my case for that. So the way I'll posit this is that broadly, I would argue there's a crisis of liberal politics around the world. And what I don't necessarily subscribe to the term populism in all of its complexity, because I think there's a lot to be talked about there. But in a sense, that the emergence of what once upon a time the Frankfurt School called authoritarian personalities is something that, of course, is not just happening in Pakistan. It's happening globally, both in West and non-West. And I think that's one sort of peg that I would like to sort of emphasize. The other two things are also both, are reflected in Pakistan's contemporary experience with Imran Khan and more generally, and also allow us to think across different contexts. One is demography. So, as many of you will know, studying South Asia or familiar with South Asia, this is the youngest region in the world. And it's quite stunning if you think about the figures, right? Pakistan's population, 65% of the population is under the age of 29. That's about 150 million people. That's a lot of people. And if you add India to the mix, then you go into approximating 1 billion people in the region. Add other countries to and then Sub-Saharan Africa has a similar demographic profile. Indonesia also has a very young population. So one of the things that I think structurally underlying not just the emergence of certain forms of politics, but definitely what I've called authoritarian personalities, is this question of demography. And then they're related, and the third conceptual sort of concern that I have and that I'm interested in exploring is technology, and particularly digitalization. And Imran Khan is very much a product of digitalization, just as you will see with Modi in India, and you'll see with a lot of other contemporary. Trump, the Twitter president, for instance. So digitalization, I think, is a big story here to work through and think through. 10 years or so ago, there was this perception, there was this belief that social media and the new sort of ICTs were going to give rise to a more progressive moment with the Arab Spring and Occupy. And that happened to an extent, at least in the West, when you think about Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn. But by and large, that progressive phenomenon has largely been eclipsed by the right. And that, I think, when we sort of take that story and think about sort of the non-West, and in my case Pakistan, but also India, and there's other examples that I'll sort of hint at as I go along. So there's these are the three sort of pegs, sort of underlying structural sort of aspects to this story. Of course, one could spend a lot of time, as we were just briefly, informally, talking about palace intrigues, and that is always a part of the story in Pakistan. And I don't want to discount that, but for me, I think there's greater worth to exploring some longer-term trends, and that's why, as the title suggests, he's been booted out of power right now. But if we think through these sort of this conceptual story, then there's every chance that this is, as the title suggests, maybe just a new beginning. So to start with the first sort of broader comparative question of liberal politics, or the crisis of liberal politics, and I want to situate that within the story of the post-Cold War world. And for me, it's a political economy story which demands that we interrogate what neoliberal globalization has generated. And there's a number of different things that I want to emphasize. First and foremost, it is in Pakistan in particular, it has been characterized by a steady financialization of the economy. And that was most sort of, in a sense, encapsulated under the Musharraf regime, where after 2001, a lot of affluent Pakistanis sent back a lot of money into Pakistan and invested it largely, not entirely, but largely in what was called hot capital, right? So the Musharraf regime guaranteed free entry and exit, and you could put in a lot of money into the stock market, and most notably into real estate, and generate big returns, and take that money out as quickly as you wanted. That then sort of gives rise to what, in the Indian story in particular, also that's a slightly different sort of, or considerably different context, China, but also similarly in Pakistan, gave rise to what was almost mythically called the global middle class. Right? So in India, we talk 300 million people. In Pakistan, there's some studies done not so recently in 2012, 2013, where a researcher at an institution called PIDE estimated that the Pakistani sort of global middle class that had come into existence at the turn of the millennium approximated about 60 million, 65 million, about a third of the population. Now, that there's some truth to that story, certainly, but this is a pretty volatile sort of story of upward mobility, and I think the pandemic demonstrates that when the flows of labor and capital that we associated with the high era of globalization are subjected to shocks, then you see millions of people streaming out of Indian cities on foot. And a lot of those are potentially part of that, the lower ends of that middle class. And one stat that I saw put 230 million Indians falling below the poverty line a year after the pandemic. So this is a pretty volatile story of mobility, which fits with the story of financialization more generally, right? There's gains to be had in certain sectors. This is not a classic industrialization story. This is a story of quick money to be made, but also a story that is of volatility. That is the political economy story that I think underlies both sides of the rise of authoritarian personalities. When the going is good, then we can talk about development and delivery, and about a middle class that's doing well and watching the IPL and buying brand new spanking cars on lease. And when the going is bad, then you fall back upon hateful rhetoric. And there's always someone else to blame for the fact that you are not getting your share. Now, in the West, there's a slightly different dynamic, which is also associated with globalization, where the steel belt becomes the rust belt, and the old white working class, which used to vote blue, ends up voting red, right? Or in Britain, the classic industrial towns of Liverpool and Sheffield and Manchester, which were Labour strongholds, ended up voting for the Tories. And that's the other side of globalization, of outsourcing and offshoring. But I think that is often a part of the story about the rise of these individuals that tends to be missed out, right? That there is something deeper going on beneath the surface. And it is a story that requires us to go back, at least to the beginnings of the globalization success story. These days, of course, we are all witness to a world in which Russian oligarchs are bad. But then, why only Russian oligarchs? And the oligarchy story in Russia or Ukraine or Eastern Europe started with the colored revolutions of the post-Cold War period. But they were always illiberal democracies. Those were never liberal democracies worth their name. So I think that there is a question around liberal politics to be interrogated. Pakistan, of course, was never depicted as a liberal democracy, even at the best of times. But that's why I suggested to you a little bit earlier that I think that there's some broader comparative questions that can be looked at. So, in a sense, Imran Khan is also, for me, Imran Khan is part of the lineage that starts with Musharraf. Sort of an upwardly mobile middle class, really loved Musharraf, bought into Musharraf. The Diaspora was a big part of that story. And that is the same lineage of sort of broadly lineage that you will see buying into the Imran Khan story. We hate corrupt politicians. We hate patronage. And we want someone who is not corrupt himself, who can deliver, and so on and so forth. And as I said, as long as the going is good, then there's one part of them. When the going is bad, then you give rise to more reactionary tendencies. And this is encapsulated in a lot of Imran's rhetoric around Islam versus the West. But he is very erratic, right? Because then, as he was departing office, there was he actually spent a lot of time in office talking about Modi as Hitler and so on and so forth. And then right before he left, he started playing up how India and Modi are very sort of autonomous, and they can never be shouted down to by the West. So it's very erratic. It's very culturalist, right? There's a neglect of deeper political economy dynamics, and you play to the gallery. So going on to the second and third points, where I'm talking about the lineage of the Musharraf years, is a demographic question, right? So when Imran was still a small player in Pakistan at the turn of the millennium, and of course he has a celebrity sort of story in the cricket and the World Cup and so on and so forth, and not being of a political lineage, but he also really played up, I am the leader of the youth. This was a big part, this was a big sort of ideological sort of pillar that I sort of represent young people and their aspirations for change, their aspirations to be free of clientelism and the old guard. And that sort of segment of a young, sort of more upwardly mobile population came of age, first of all, in 2007. I was on the streets with that population. A lot of them were my students. When they came out on the streets against the Musharraf dictatorship under the guise of the rule of law. And one of my students, who was a student at an elite private university in Lahore called LUMS, and this dovetails with the third part of my story, for the very first time started a digital sort of newspaper called the Emergency Times. And this was a young, upwardly mobile, globalized middle class with an access to a language of democracy and rule of law, and using newly emergent technologies to articulate a particular sentiment. And Imran took that and ran with it. And so in a sense, this youthful population, a youthful political subject, as it were, emerges at the turn of the millennium. And, with the 2010s, then it explodes into life. And an insider of the early PTI, the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, which is Imran's party, recently contributed a book chapter to a book on Pakistan's political parties. And I encourage some of you to read it. Her name is Tabinda Khan, and she was a PTI insider. And she describes how this was the first time in Pakistan's history of a political party digitizing their membership and using digital means to reach out to young people, both at home and in the diaspora. And this hadn't happened before. The other big parties in Pakistan are still playing catch-up. The Muslim League and the People's Party are still playing catch-up. Some of you will be familiar with Nawaz Sharif's daughter, Maryam Nawaz. She's really taken to Twitter and is sort of understood. She's also 40-something, a younger generation, but they're still playing catch-up. And Imran was the first, sort of global digitized brand of politics. And that's why I think this is a comparative story, not dissimilar to the way Modi and the BJP appealed to a not dissimilar demographic and used the digital space as one of its pegs to articulate the sense of newness, to articulate a sense of we are departing from the old guard and the Congress and those who have failed you and so on and so forth. Not dissimilar to the Erdogans of the world, not dissimilar, you go west, to the Nigel Farages and Trumps of the world. Of course, as I said, there's substantial differences socially and structurally within all of these contexts. But as I said, I think there's much value to thinking about these authoritarian personalities within a comparative framework. So if we take that sort of as our building block and we move then towards the more palace intrigue part of the story. The sad reality, however, is that no matter how well you do this, sort of this story of appealing to young people and talking about newness and change, and then using digital technologies to do so, you still rely a lot on old entrenched interests. And of course, Imran could never have come to power without that peg as well. Now that's the less advertised part of the story, the less hyped part of the story. But until 2013, he only ever won one seat in Parliament. And it was from 2011 onwards, where he had this big public meeting in Lahore, where sort of the graph sort of went exponentially upwards. And that in Pakistan's context is again, I don't want to suggest that's the only, as I said, there's other parts of the story, but that's owed in particular to what in Pakistan we call electables. There's a term that is used widely. These are constituency level politicians, not dissimilar to any first past the post system. India is similar, who rely largely on patronage. We were just talking over lunch. It's about what wins you votes is whether you disperse development funds, how many jobs you disperse to your constituents, how well you deal with in Pakistan and India, I suspect similarly, how you mediate the Thana and the Kachari and the Patwari and local dynamics of power. And it was when that constituency level politician starts to flood the ranks of the PTI that you see sort of some sort of clear shift away from sort of the where it starts, sort of the newness and the young and all of that, to something not dissimilar to the entrenched parties. And of course, how can I've gone, what is it now, 15 minutes, and I haven't even mentioned the army yet. So that's where the army comes in. You can't possibly get beyond 10 or 15 minutes in Pakistan and not talk about the army. And mind you, there's a lineage here as well. So I talked about the Musharraf lineage. there's a longer term lineage here. The army, not dissimilar to sort of how we think about, this is Tan Tayong territory, to colonial Punjab and the kinds of political lineages that existed back in the day, even 150 years ago. Clean, efficient administration, and politics is something, in a sense, that is not, let's not say to be vilified, but certainly to be frowned upon. So the idea of a Punjab school of administration back in the day was also on this peg of sort of colonial educated classes that wanted efficient administration and delivery. And that began in Pakistan's case as early as 1958. It's remarkable, actually, I put it in here. If you look at what the Press Pakistan note on the day after Ayub Khan's coup, like the formal government of Pakistan press release about why Ayub Khan launched a coup, it's as if Imran Khan could have been giving a speech. It's about corruption, it's about the old entrenched politicians, it's all of the same tropes. There's not a word of difference that you will find. And so there is that is the lineage in Pakistan's context that the army has always upheld. Politics is bad, politicians are corrupt, politicians always mess it up, and then we come in to save the day. So there's an old story here that is being rehashed at the same time, and that, of course, the fine print is we're going to get electables in to make sure you get a parliamentary majority, and that was the less advertised part of the story, but of course was crucial. It was 2013, they managed to piece together enough to win government in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, which was also an anti-incumbency vote because that's where the war on terror and the violence around the war on terror was most acute. Incidentally, they've had 2 successive terms in KP. They won in 2018 as well. And then it was in 2018, of course, that then the PTI wins government at the center. But again, something we were just discussing briefly. That would not have happened without 2 very crucial Musharraf-era allies, the MQM and what Asif Zardari once called the Qatil League, Muslim League Q, which was, of course, is a break-off of the Nawaz Sharif's Muslim League after the 1999 coup. Now, this is all very complicated for those who are not familiar, but what I'm trying to suggest to you is there's a lot of old to go with the so-called new here. And it was, in fact, the MQM and the Muslim League CAF who, in the most recent iteration of the palace intrigue, withdraw their support to the PTI, and the wafer-thin majority that Imran was able to cobble together in 2018 then collapses. Now, in Pakistan over the last 3 or 4 months, the term neutrality has underlied all of this. And what do I mean by neutrality? Well, this was all coming about because apparently the army had become neutral. So, i.e., the army had backed Imran to the hilt prior to coming to power, and then for the first 3 years after coming to power. And then things started to go awry last year in October. We'll get to that. And after that, we heard there was one term that was used commonly in Pakistan for 3 years, which was same page. So the civil and the military leadership are on the same page. And then after October 21, they were no longer on the same page. And the army apparently became neutral, i.e. the army was not going to intervene to ensure that sort of small parties like the MQM or the CAF League would stay on board. And the event of October 21, this is also a very old hackneyed theme in Pakistan's history. A sitting prime minister intervenes in the internal autonomy of the army by seeking to, in fact, not this time appoint a new chief of the ISI, but retain the chief of the ISI, who was General Faiz Hamid, who in October the army chief decided that he wanted to replace him and send him off to become a corps commander in Peshawar. And then there was a summary sitting in the Prime Minister's office for 3 weeks, unsigned. Of course, there was much, i.e. the Prime Minister refused to sign off on it. Eventually he did, but as it were, the damage was done. The same page was no longer the same page. And since then, there's been a pretty rapid unraveling. As I said, the army was neutral, so to speak. The wafer-thin majority was now at risk, and which all culminates in the events of March, April, a month ago, which were very dramatic. Of course, on the surface, this was something that happened very legally, and there was a vote of no confidence, and the Supreme Court got involved. But really, the truth is that the army had basically pulled back from its position of unconditional support. Now, there's a couple of other things before I stop, and then we can sort of open it up. One is the response that has followed, which takes me back to where I began, which is the upwardly mobile, relatively urban, sort of support base, young, digital. All of that has reemerged in a big way, both in the weeks leading up to Imran's deposal, and particularly afterwards. So you'll see, like, the biggest demonstrations after he was deposed took place in Clifton, in Karachi. Big, like, about approximately 100,000 people come out. Now, Clifton, for those of you who know, is a pretty elite area. And you saw similar things happening in Lahore, in Gulberg, or you saw in F9 Park in Islamabad. Now, this is not to be dismissed, of course, and that's why I started with that. This is real, because there are a lot of young people, and they are heavily mobilized by these tropes of newness and change and anti-corruption and so on and so forth. And they have means at their disposal, especially the digital space, which, as we know around the world, and as you know, because it's the first time we're meeting in person, everything we did was on Zoom, which is substantially changing the world as we know it, and particularly modes of political communication. It seems like a bad dream now, but Trump never needed the mainstream media because he had Twitter. And that was real, and it brought him to power. And so that is not to be dismissed, and that's why, as the title of this discussion suggests, he's been kicked out of power, in part, and I would say the X factor being because he lost favor with the army, or at least the current chief, and I'll come back to that as well. But that sort of very vocal, not necessarily a support base that can translate into electoral constituencies. I think that's an important gap to think through. But that young, digitally mobilized support base is real, and it will continue to be real, and it will continue to shape Pakistani politics in the years to come. Whether that means Imran comes back into power or not is a separate matter. But just as when everybody was cheering Joe Biden for beating Trump, what is it now, 18 months ago, Trumpism isn't dead, right? And as we know, Trump might well run for election in 2024, and who's to say that he might come back into power? And you see around the world that these authoritarian personalities are alive and well and kicking. There'll be dips, but I believe Orban just won again in Hungary. Bolsonaro is in trouble in Brazil, but you wouldn't put it past him, or sort of similar. So the point is to say that there's, again, to go back to where I started, there's something broader globally here for us to think about. The second thing about what I think Imran's strategy, or any Pakistani politician's strategy, of course that's in a sense how the current now incumbents have come back into power, the Sharifs and the Bhuttos, is you still curry favor with the army. The army is still arbiter of politics. And notably, most very important, didn't have a chance to talk about it today, but also arguably the most important economic player in Pakistan. It's corporate entities, it's nominally private companies, get all sorts of hidden subsidies, they get all the contracts. There's not a single road that is built in Pakistan where the FWO and the NLC do not get most of the contracts. There's not a toll booth on our highways that is not being run by the FWO. These are all army-run companies. And I'll close with this. While there's a sense, and that's probably how even what I've described suggests, that he's fallen out with the army, I think there's a bit more to that than falling out with the army. I think actually what happened was he wanted his guy in the army to stay on, or potentially to get him through the next election. And these are all forms of speculation. I'm not an army insider by any stretch of the imagination, so I can't do any more accurate speculation than you. But especially in the mid-ranking officer, he has a lot of support. He continues to have a lot of support. That is obvious. And a lot of social media trends after he's gone also suggest that. Right? So you'll have these strange Twitter trends where they will be very anti-Bajwa, who's the army chief, and at parallel you will have trends where Faiz Hamid and this other guy, Asif Ghafoor, who's the head of the army public relations wing, you have PTI sort of troll armies sort of celebrating and championing those two. Now, I don't think that that's just by chance. And so if in a country where palace intrigues run deep, who's to say that in another iteration that Imran might not again have some support in the army. And I do think that there's something to be said for, and Imran Khan's government is a case study of this. For all of the vociferous support that he enjoyed, he had a very thin parliamentary majority. In fact, Nawaz Sharif's government from 2013 to 2018 was an anomaly. It was the first time, I believe, possibly ever, maybe aside from 1970, after East Pakistan seceded and the People's Party became the biggest party, that a government had 2/3 majority, which is what Nawaz Sharif had. Imran PTI didn't even have a simple majority. He had to get these other guys on board. And that also suits the army, to have a weak government, always potentially at risk of being undermined by some kind of parliamentary maneuvering or extra parliamentary maneuvering. There's one part of this story which I haven't got at, which is a slightly more alarming part of the story, which also speaks to digitalization, young people, and the crisis of liberal politics, which is that Imran Khan is one form of center-right politics. There's much further to the right politics, which also appeals to young people and uses digital means like the Tehreek-e-Labbaik. I have observed, because I've done research to write a book, that Tehreek-e-Labbaik has the ability to run social media trends uncontested by anyone. And we are talking lower middle class young kids who are familiar with TikTok and Facebook and Twitter, and who can run, and they do, some of you will be familiar, they do blasphemy politics around the question of the finality of the Prophet. It leads to mob violence, and it is extremely high intensity and pretty dangerous stuff. So a youthful population where, in an increasingly financialized economy, job creation is low. They're all looking for work, they don't have work, and they are ever more prone to finding an other to blame for their problems if you can't meet their needs. And Imran is one version of that, but you can go much further to the right. I think we could talk about India, we could talk about other contexts again. But I do want to insist in closing that there are some things about Pakistan which are exceptional, certainly. Weaponization of religion was exceptional, but is increasingly less exceptional. The army is certainly something specific, but there's something broader at work here, and I think it demands more comparison and more sort of discussion across contexts, particularly in regions like South Asia, where we have similar demographics, and where, in times to come, when you have hundreds of millions of young people looking for work and not having their aspirations met, when they can, look through the digital looking glass and see, almost palpably see that lifestyle but not have access to it. And I think the possibility of more hateful politics will deepen. So I'll stop there and hope that
Thank
we
you.
have questions and discussion.
Thank you. Thank you for, I think, a very insightful presentation. We now open up for the question-answer session. If you could please introduce yourselves before you ask the question, that would be great. Yeah.
My name is thank you very much for your insights, Dr. Asif. You mentioned everyone in there, the army, the politicians, TLP. You left the elephant in the room out of it. Absolutely not. American interference and the frenzy of US diplomats meeting politicians. So what's your view on that? Thank you.
Okay, maybe we can take 3 questions and then you can answer them?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay.
Yeah, my question's actually a little related to that. So, Imran Khan did make claims of foreign interference and suggesting a US hand in what's happening in getting him off the Prime Minister's seat. Is this something that's common in Pakistan, as someone who doesn't really keep track of domestic politics? My question is, how much of a role do these claims of foreign interference have in populist narratives?
And you forgot to introduce yourself.
I'm sorry, I'm Ramita and I'm a research analyst at ISAS.
Thanks for that insightful talk, Asim. I had a quick question. You, right at the fag end, mentioned the TLP and the mobilization against Imran Khan by Fazlur Rahman and people who were out on the streets. But one of the sort of trends that we've seen with populism is how populist leaders, and this is from quite a variant in India, Turkey, how they've actually been able to harness religion or forces of religion in their in the enterprise. How do you see that sort of fitting in the sort of Pakistan case, and specifically on Imran? Because of course you've seen opposition to him clustered around TLP, etc. But we also seen initially when Imran Khan came formed the government, talk of this new Medina, etc. And how, of course, we all know, especially followers of cricket, how he was sort of a playboy in his earlier avatar, and then he increasingly projects a different image. So the relationship between religion, which is of course important not just in Pakistan but elsewhere.
Great questions. Certainly the elephant in the room. I don't know if you've observed, I'm sure you have, you noticed that in the same period, State Department has issued I wouldn't even call that, I don't know what one would call them, but like pretty clear policy statements to Delhi. You better stop buying Russian gas. This is par for the course for the Americans. I don't see anything in what the Americans did in sending that cable via a Pakistani diplomat in DC that they don't otherwise do. I mean, this is what America does. It's the gangster of the world. They speak that language. They issue veiled threats if you don't do this. So that part of the story, that there was something dramatic or unique about this, no, I don't think so. I'll tell you a story which is, again, par for the course. I have a friend in PIA who works in procurement. Some years ago, before it went completely bust, and they gave up the idea, they were about to buy a new fleet. They only had enough, as they said, the procurement guy said, look, we've been told we can buy 6 jets, and I have to do the diligence and check out what's an option. And so he said, I spent 6 months doing research, and I concluded that Airbus is clearly better. It's in terms of like the cost-benefit analysis, and I submitted my report and so on and so forth. And then I got a call from the Ministry of Defense, IEGHQ, saying, take your report back and say that we're going to buy Boeing. And then he was asked why. He's like, because we got a call from the Pentagon. You buy Boeing. That's all. So there's nothing new to this. Whether it's they arm twist the generals or they arm twist whoever is in the Prime Minister's office, there's nothing new to what happened with regards to, I mean, it was a terribly timed visit to Moscow, admittedly, that he showed up there the day Putin invaded the Ukraine. And I tend to subscribe to, some of you will have seen this morning, what the ex-Brazilian president said. Zelensky is as responsible as Putin for all of it. I agree with that. But that doesn't mean that Imran Khan was kicked out by the Americans. That's classic populism at work. I think he was kicked out by again, the army went neutral, and he lost his majority. Now, which takes me to the next question. This is not new. Some of you may recall, in 2002, when Musharraf held his first election, in KP, which is very interesting, the same KP where Imran first came to power in 2013, a 6-party religious alliance called the Muttahida Majlis-e-Amal, including Fazlur Rahman. In fact, Fazlur Rahman's guy was the chief minister, Akram Durrani, won the election. And their entire politics was anti-America. This is America's war. We don't support it. They won an election. They were a Musharraf ally. So there's nothing new about the fact that, right-wing reactionaries of various stripes, they can be religious parties, they can be baghair dadi wala, as we say. There are some who are same, but without a dadi, without a beard. So for me, it's not an elephant in the room, right? It's patently obvious that America exercises great influence over Pakistan. They've been doing it since at least 1954, if not earlier, via all of these military dictators, via the lending agencies. And they've been doing it, there's of course another aspect that people talk about with CPEC in China, and that's been at least 8 years since CPEC was signed, and in fact the Muslim League was very gung-ho with CPEC in its first term. And in fact, one of the things that it's saying right now is that we are going to restore, Imran dragged his feet on CPEC, and we are going to sort of take back Chinese development projects. So all of this is, for me, is par for the course. It's old news, it's been done before, it happens regularly. It is a big trope in Pakistani politics, whether it be America in particular or the West more generally. And then that leads to the third question, where you can say that in various versions of populism, but conveniently neglect the structural. You can make it culturalist. So this is about the West versus Islam, the way it's depicted. This is about how they're out to kill Muslims and wage war against Islam, which of course the Western right wing has done its best to fuel, right? Because you have authoritarian personalities doing this in the West as well, fanning Islamophobia and doing all sorts of stuff in with vis-a-vis immigration and so on and so forth. So it's both of these sides fuel each other. So in a sense, I don't think that my view very firmly is that there's nothing in Imran's dismissal to suggest that it represented some very acute form of intervention, which already doesn't exist. So American intervention is a reality. It's a structural phenomenon of Pakistan's politics and economy, and it's particularly the military, and it's in terms of its patronage by the Pentagon. But there's nothing there, and it's also been done before, and it will continue to be done. Interestingly, the TLP, 8th March last year. 8th March is International Women's Day. And I am very closely involved with progressive politics, so we held rallies, and one of the organizations that held a rally is called the Women's Democratic Front. And I urge you to look this up because it was pretty gruesome at the time, but it's, one can either laugh and cry about it. And the Women's Democratic Front has a flag which has 3 colors on it: purple, yellow, and blue. If you take the purple out and you make it red, it looks like the French flag. And after 8th March, a lot of women were accused of engaging in blasphemy on 8th March rallies. And then they photoshopped the flag, and they said, this is all happening at the behest of the French. And the French ambassador is funding it. This happens all the time. And Imran, to take your question, embodies this culturalist narrative, right? Where you conveniently pick and choose. So Imran's big thing in recent times, if you've observed his speeches, I know the West. I've been there, done that. I know the West better than the West itself, sort of thing. It reminds me of Yahya Khan, who used to say that about the Bengalis. I know the Bengalis better than the Bengalis know himself. And so you can, in some ways, almost, it's this strange sort of positive fascination with this guy who's won us a World Cup, who's been a playboy, but now is a born-again Muslim, and is standing up to the West. Minus all of the fine print about how our economy is functioning and all of the. And interestingly, you'll have seen there's this guy. What's his name? Arif Habib, the securities guy, right? The Abraj group. There's plenty such characters. Half of the people, Imran's closest advisors, are basically diaspora Pakistanis with big-time business interests. There's one guy, Shabazz Gill, who flits back and forth between. You can ignore all of that, and you can talk about how the West is doing all of this conspiracy, and it's because of the narrative is so deep, is so superficial, and is based on some sort of this them and us culturalist view of the world. For on the surface, it looks like how does he manage this? But I think it ties into now 2 or 3 decades of the war on terror, America's war. We are bearing the brunt of it. This is a war on Muslims, and a public discourse that doesn't delve deeper than that. That doesn't talk about, for instance, as I said, there's another character who all of Pakistan's parties, including the PTI, did nothing about, Malik Riaz. Okay, this guy is basically runs this entity called Beria Town. So Beria means the Navy. So he uses the name of the army. All of his people on his running the Beria Town enterprise are retired army guys. And it's basically a big land grab. They essentially grab land all over the countries, make these gated housing communities. And Nawaz Sharif, Zardari, and the PTI. They had nothing on. So these and a lot of it is diaspora money coming in, investing in plots. This is all consistent with the same group of people saying. It's very interesting when Imran got kicked out. You saw a lot of these big videos of people in Walthamstow in London, burning their passports or something, some fake passport. They're burning it, and the West is conspiring against our guy. It is a confused and very contradictory narrative, but it's perfectly consistent with how populism is based on this emphasis on them and us, minus the messiness of particularly of, I think, financialization, as I described at the beginning.
Yep. Next round of questions.
Thanks so much, Asam. My name is Karthik. I'm a research fellow here. I have a couple of questions. First is, and I've been asking a lot of people, a lot of friends who work on Pakistan, the same question. You've been hearing a lot about a geo-economic foreign policy for the last couple of years or so. I still don't know what that means, because the way when I think about geoeconomics, it's usually when sort of governments begin to start talking about it when the economies are thriving, they are connected, you have investment pouring in, and they're focused on trade and other aspects to grow their economy, right? Which hasn't been happening in Pakistan of late. And it also there's a tension between populism and geoeconomics as well, right? And so how do you square that tension? I'm just sort of hoping to hear your views on that. And second, in terms of the political economy, which you sort of sketched out, and I'm wondering if you can just maybe speak to how it's, or given Hamza Alavi's work on the overdeveloped state in Pakistan and between the military, bureaucratic, oligarchy, how does your assessment of these different actors and new actors and forces like digitalization change and affect that landscape? How has that changed in your view? Yeah, thanks.
Hi, my name is Kuntavi. I'm a research analyst at ISAS. Thank you for the insightful discussion. My question is from the factors that we've discussed today. And I wanted to talk a little about the worsening economic crisis in Pakistan. I was wondering, with the recent political developments, there have been political instability and the economic crisis has gotten worse. It's one of the reasons why the opposition wanted to push Imran Khan out as well, saying that he can't handle the economic crisis. I was wondering, does the army still benefit from this kind of instability? At what point would we see the army struggle with this economic crisis? Because the political instability has sort of just deepened it. That was my question. So thank you.
Okay, maybe, is there anybody else? And we can take three at one. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, related to actually the economy. My name is Masadur Rahman. I'm visiting research fellow at ISAS. So you see the South Asian countries, almost all countries' economy is falling after this COVID and now this war. And we see the recent experience in Sri Lanka. Even Bangladesh economy is very strong, but recently balance of payment has fallen down like $10 billion from positive to negative $10 billion, except Indian economy. So how do you think this South Asian economy, compared to Pakistan, and how Pakistan is dealing with this, to overcome all these issues because if this new government came in power? And how did they have any expectation, any policy, or anything they suggesting, okay, we have targeted this and we want to achieve this by next 1 year or 2 years? Is there anything you are seeing in the future of Pakistan economy?
Yeah. Again, it sounds like a lot of these questions dovetail. I'm not entirely sure, honestly speaking, what geoeconomics is myself. But you're right, this is a term that is, sort of in circulation. But what one understands by it to the extent that it does is that economics or economic interests or shared economic interests should or will, in an ideal world, determine how states interact as opposed to politics in some kind of narrow sense. Now, what I find interesting about that is that so long as what was called the Washington Consensus was a consensus before 2007-8, when it all came crashing down, wasn't that what was happening? Wasn't the world apparently very free, and there was no restrictions on trade and finance? So this is, I think this is why I started at the beginning. There's a broader crisis of liberal politics, where we want it to be consistent with notions of a world of unrestricted movement for capital, but that generates immiseration and it generates inequality, and that has happened not just in our parts of the world, but it also happened in the West, right, with offshoring and outsourcing. And those contradictions, the contradictions of an unmoored, sort of unrestricted notion of economic growth and so-called cooperation, but without the necessary safeguards and redistributive mechanisms to make sure that enough of that wealth flows to the lower orders of society, that is actually what gave rise, in my reading, to these authoritarian personalities to begin with, because the fallouts is the terrain on which they thrive, and then a lot of then this contradiction emerges, or becomes more and more acute. So you're absolutely right. There is an inbuilt tension. On the one hand, you're saying we want to open it up, but on the other hand, now you have in the West people saying we're going to turn our back on globalization. We want the jobs to come back. We don't want to outsource and offshore anymore. Now, whether that will happen or not is a different matter. You know, will Foxconn stop manufacturing iPhones in China and bring it back to America? Highly unlikely. But, you know, aside from whether that happens or not, it is where illiberal politics thrives, right? That you can say, oh, well, this is happening because they took all our jobs. Whether we sent our jobs abroad or the immigrants came and took them in our country. In the West, in our countries, you know, with COVID and now with the supply shocks because of the Ukraine war, I think it's going to become more acute. But in our story, the parallel for our story would be the middle class story, in my reading. So globalization gave rise to windfall gains for everyone. A lot of people rose up and became middle class, and it was all a feel-good story. But it's based on, as I just shared with you, this book documents many such examples. It's based on dispossession. You're kicking out tons and tons of people from their livelihoods and from small-holding agriculture to build these suburban gated housing schemes so that a diaspora middle class can have plots to speculate on. You know, there's an underlying problem with that model of... Now, if you want a different model of so-called geoeconomics, for me, that would entail something like an India-Pakistan peace dividend. You open the border, you let trade... By the way, trade... undocumented trade across the border is pretty substantial in any case. In Pakistan, if you close the border for a day, the price of tomatoes rises to 250 rupees a kilo. And if that's both borders, you close the Torkham or the Chaman border on the west, or the Indian border, whether it's the Rajasthani border or the border with Punjab. So in practice, there is an informal sort of mutual cooperation, so-called people-to-people happening. Now you can institutionalize that, but then where does the bogeyman go? And in Pakistan's case, possibly even in India's case. So there's an inbuilt tension between the imperatives of strategic enmity and state nationalism, and then an economic model that is genuinely, for me, the neoliberal success years may have been a success for some, but they certainly weren't a success for society at large. And that becomes, I think that gets put into stark relief when there are shocks to the system, right? Like COVID, like the Ukraine war. Now, what that means then is even economy. Sri Lanka was always, in a sense, the most welfare-oriented economic model in South Asia, right? High levels of health, education, of course with a very clear ethnicized distinction. But Sri Lanka, tourists stopped coming, and it basically just fell through the cracks, right, in a sense. And then you have a populist, interestingly, an army guy with his brothers running the country into the ground. So that's why I started off saying that there's something happening which is not just Pakistan specific. There's something broader. I don't think that India is come out of this 3 or 4 years unscathed at all. I mean, if you take that figure that I offered you, there's 230 million people in Pakistan. The same number of people in India have fallen below the poverty line. That's a crisis. It's just not a crisis that is documented, because if you choose to neglect, the classes that perhaps don't fit the narrative. So I think which suggests that there's an imperative that whether you call it geo-economics or whatever, regional cooperation, something that facilitates this very young population across the entire region, and where you can engage in a redistributive program. And in fact, in Pakistan's case, look, otherwise you're going to keep going back to the IMF. And the IMF is going to say, hike your fuel prices or slash your what they call pro-rich subsidies. I'm not entirely convinced that it can be called a pro-rich subsidy. Maybe technically you can call it a pro-rich subsidy because the rich have more cars. But, the poor or the working classes spend a lot more of their income filling up their motorcycles. So you can call it a pro-rich subsidy, but its impacts are going to be felt all the way down to the bottom. The only other way to get out of that is to, Dr. Ishrat is here, is to deal with what is an elitist economy, right? That's what his book is called. There are hidden subsidies of all kinds given to the army, given to real estate moguls who can get away with bloody murder. And then, by the way, Malik Riaz was allowed to wire back 190 million pounds from the UK to pay off his fines to the Supreme Court. On the basis of he was fined by the Supreme Court for all sorts of illegal land grabbing practices. So if you do not tax the upper echelons, if you give them hidden subsidies, if you do not engage in some kind of redistributive program, I'll give you an example. I'm associated with a small left of center political party. The guy who founded our party, his name is Abid Hassan Minto. In 2011, 11 years ago, we filed a case in the Supreme Court of Pakistan saying that Pakistan had legislated in 1977, right before Bhutto was overthrown, that a land ceiling for agricultural land. 150 acres irrigated, 300 acres unirrigated. This was passed, it's law. Ziaul Haq showed up, and under the tutelage of the elephant in the room, weaponized Islam and told everybody that these are the moral equivalents of America's founding fathers. And in 1989, the Federal Shariat Court, which Ziaul Haq created, declared that legislation to be un-Islamic. So we filed a petition in 2011 saying it's not un-Islamic, and we gave a whole bunch of legal arguments to demonstrate this. And it has been 11 years that the Supreme Court refuses to hear our petition. Because God forbid that you take land from those who have too much and give it to those who don't have enough. So for me, the question of the economy is fundamentally a question of some kind of trade and cooperation that for the lower echelons of society rather than for the bigwigs, and redistributive programs within the country. They can happen, but someone has to have the political will to do so. And to go back to where I started, I think that a young population is willing to be politicized further. I think that the Imran Khan phenomenon, if nothing else, tells us that young people are able and willing to think through what needs to happen to really bring some newness, right? Beyond like some just vacuous slogan of Naya Pakistan. And that is some kind of I think, substantial redistributive program. I don't think you can, any of these countries, whether it be Sri Lanka, whether it be Bangladesh, whether it be India, but you don't have, unfortunately, in the political mainstream, you don't have sort of a left of center party that is floating that sort of program. Basically, mainstream politics is a competition between various, for me, in my reading, various shades of the right. Some very far, and some maybe what Tariq Ali called the extreme center. Sort of something like a new Labour, which claimed to be Labour but wasn't. And I think that is what's giving rise to this crisis. And as far as the Pakistani army is concerned, I don't know. I can't say that they are willing or able to think about a peace dividend. One of the other ways to deal with Pakistan's perpetual budgetary problems or balance of payments crises is the fact that you have this huge constantatious consumption of massive imports and not enough exports. These are all separate matters. But you spend 25% of your every budget on the army. And you'll be surprised how much of that is just what a friend of ours, a well-known economist, Kaisar Bengali in Pakistan, calls non-combat defense expenditures. It's got nothing to do with defense. It's pensions, it's kickbacks, it's various forms of hidden subsidies to army-run companies, but nobody calls this out. So then you are going to be, subject to these shocks, which you don't control. Or when you have such a huge fuel import bill, which Pakistan has, right? Then you're going to go off like the new prime minister just did, go off to Saudi Arabia and basically ask for some delayed payments to import more fuel. Now, I don't know enough about Sri Lanka or the other countries to suggest what would need to happen domestically, but my feeling is that there are similar long-term crises brewing, right? Where these are not now countries where the economic model is based on job creation or substantial industrialization to deal with. So if in Sri Lanka's case, COVID dries up the tourists, what are you going to, and then you have a bunch of guys who refuse to let go of power and create some kind of sort of vetting period where perhaps so the combination of a model that generated inequality and then gave rise to populists who played on that inequality, but partially by in some ways refusing to name the causes of it, I think it's this downward spiral. And certainly, it's, of course, the EU is in tatters, but maybe the EU offers some, at least what happened after the Second World War. They went at each other, tens of millions dead, and then they created the European cooperation arrangement, and that certainly, in the long run, economically, was to the benefit of the region at large. I'm not sure that that's about to happen in South Asia. That's only going to happen with politics with some vision. And I actually don't think that there's anyone thinking long term. That's the last thing I'll end up with. Basically, they think election to election. And one of the things we were just talking about is that a government, so for instance, the Muslim League is in power. Half of their target will be like, okay, let's discontinue whatever the last government started. Then the other guys will come back in power and be like, well, the Muslim League is so awful, let's make sure we... Interestingly, one of the relatively successful sort of persistent policies has been some kind of cash transfer to the lowest segments, right? Unconditional cash transfers, which was once upon a time, because it started by the People's Party in 2010, was called the Benazir Income Support Program. For 3 years, they refused to call it the Benazir Income Support Program because it's Benazir's name in it. So they changed the name to Asas. And the day the government was going, then the Benazir Income Support Program came back into... Thank God they didn't discontinue it, and they just had politics over the name of it. But most of the question of vision and what kind of vision, like I said, I don't think there's the political will to engage in redistributive sort of politics that is required. You are indebted, you are potentially always looking to the IMF to bail you out. The IMF tells you, slash your subsidies. That then leads to another spiral where the incumbent is blamed. Then you do some populist politics and saying they're the reason everybody is failing, the country is failing, you come back into power. And the army is at the top of the tree with all of its entrenched interests, whether they be in terms of strategic or ideological sort of notions of Islam and enmity with our neighbors, or its own economic interests. That's precisely the problem. There's a lack of vision, any long-term vision, which is talking about a young population which has limited job prospects. And frankly speaking, again, this is something that I can offer you firsthand. Do not think that the TLP is just a bunch of madrasa students. It's not. If you walk into a TLP crowd, you will find university students, you will find educated kids. They're the ones running the Twitter trends. And they don't see anything other than this form of politics to articulate their grievances. I'm not saying that's the sum total, but that's certainly a segment of what's going on there. And that, I think, just like the wave of Hindu nationalism in India, I think should definitely get us thinking about some of these broader, this is not just a flash in the pan. Without alternative political visions, we're just going to be going back and forth between these sorts of options. That's my reading of it. And that's why I think that Imran is alive and well, and he will have plenty of terrain to continue operating in times to come, at least until the next election, which is at most scheduled for, I believe, July 23. So for 15 months from now.
Okay, any more questions? We have a few more minutes. Yes, please.
Thanks again, Dr. Hassan, for all the insights you've given. A lot of it new beginning, because everything else is old. The Americans, the army, the corrupt politicians. Two things which are new is TLP, and TLP has a narrative which an average Pakistani can't go against. It's a very difficult and a very dangerous one. The other part is the population, 65% less than 29 years old, right? A lot is banking on that. Now, have you done any study, or do you know any statistics of this less than 29 years, 65% population? How much of them are below the poverty line? And will they be able, or are they willing to support Imran Khan? Because those are the guys directly impacted by inflation every day. So yeah, we can understand middle class, citizens, mid-level army officers are supporting. But when it really comes to bread and butter, these guys who are below the poverty line, what matters to them is food on the table. Thank you.
No, unfortunately, I can't claim to have any definitive statistics disaggregated, for instance, across age, like what you're asking about. I was just mentioning there's again, this is a different demographic, but for me that is instructive. If that is a segment of the population that is disaffected in some ways, highly educated people, the unemployment rates are upwards of 20%. Now that's highly educated. If you go Pakistan's labor force, what I can tell you is Pakistan's labor force, 40% is self-employed. Right now, self-employed sounds great, but basically it means a street vendor, or slightly higher up the chain, an Uber or Careem contractor, right? And these are very vulnerable segments, right? They are subject to anti-encroachment, so they'll set up a street vending, and then the local municipal corporation will come and bash their truck or whatever, what we call a ready down. They live in kachi abadis, in informal settlements. Under the guise of legality, they will be bulldozed. So that, if that segment you're talking about, I don't have statistics, but as I said, I mean, the statistic of the number of people who are falling below the poverty line in India, I think is instructive. I think there's broadly speaking, I would say they would be similar. I mean, one of the big problems actually in Pakistan is precisely that we have such limit. In India, you had this whole huge academic exercise with the NCEUS, and Manmohan Singh did it, where they did a huge survey on the unorganized sector some 12, 14 years ago. I remember I spent a lot of time going through that data. We don't have that kind of data. We don't have that kind of research, frankly, happening. But I can give you anecdotal suggestions that it's a very vulnerable population, and therefore, and mind you, there's this combination. So the vocal segment of like an Imran Khan support base would be upwardly mobile, would be liberal in its outlook, right? Would talk about things like rule of law and or even American intervention and sort of nationalist assertion. But the foot soldiers, so to speak, of that populist movement are lower down the ladder. In KP, which is where he's been in power for like a close to a decade now, if you go to Peshawar, if you go to Mardan or Charsada or Swabi, you'll find a lot of, relative, like lower middle class, even lower down the chain, and they are big time PTI supporters, despite what they may or may not have delivered to them. So I do think that exists, and that's going to continue. Again, for me, it's partly about a lack of an alternative. I think that's as much of the story as anything else that I'm suggesting to you, right? Unless there's an understanding of reality that captures sort of political economy stuff and appeals and addresses, so as you say, the daily bread and butter needs, jobs, health, education, decent, dignified housing. That was a very basic, once upon a time, social democratic program. These days, it sounds like it's revolutionary. Because, like I said, mainstream politics is a competition between right and far right. And I think that is going to be reflected more and more, as you say, these lower social segments.
Any more questions? Because I think we are almost coming to the close of the seminar. Yeah? Okay, that's probably the last question. Yeah. Yours. Oh, you don't have the... Yeah.
Yeah, please.
So you spoke about having a credible opposition, and this is something that sort of comes about in South Asian politics, the lack of having another alternative to what exists. As someone who's going to become quite skeptical of how this is... Yeah, someone who's sort of becoming more skeptic by looking at South Asian countries and how they're progressing. Given that they have, they're using social media and that sort of emerged as a very important part of how populist politics is undertaken. I mean, how do you see it happening, that there can be a credible alternative that emerges at least in the next 10 years?
Yes, because that's what I spend most of my time trying to do, so I have to say yes to you.
Okay, let me just add more then. What do you think is going to bring the change? What is it that an alternative can bring, and how is that going to happen?
Look, I think that what I suggested to you is crucial, right? That there's young people who are digitally connected. They have access to ideas. They have the ability to potentially... so in a sense, there's a potential for something different. Now, will it happen? Of course, no one can say. And at the same time, digitalized forms of political communication are not very amenable to depth and to meaningful debate. So one doesn't want to be naive about that, right, and suggest that it'll happen just because the potential ingredients for something different are there. But I do think that potential needs to, like we've just done today, right? I think that the question of the redistributive story, or at least the debate over redistribution, I think if that becomes part of the mainstream in some way, I think that's the challenge, to mainstream the fact that this is not about some cultural other, who must be hated upon to solve your problems. Okay? And I do think that that's possible, and I do think that there are examples across South Asia of, different sort of social and political forces, however small, trying to do that. It's going to be hard work because they tend to be drowned out by the troll armies of the right. But I see no other option but to try. And one of the things to talk about also, which would distinguish oneself from the usual suspects, is that last question about thinking about this as some kind of regional project as well, right? That's to go beyond the very narrow state nationalism of the incumbents. I think that I certainly think that there's a potential to do so, although I do think that first and foremost, in the first instance, I think it's important to be conceptually and theoretically clear about the imperative of doing so. I think this is also about how we understand what's going on. And my sense is that we tend to focus too much on individuals and personalities rather than thinking about sort of deeper underlying phenomenon. I think at the level of scholarship, if that is something that we do, and then, of course, then there's people on the ground that have to do the hard work. But I certainly am not, I certainly am hopeful, which is why I keep trying to chip away. Otherwise, of course, if you're not hopeful, then you stop trying, right? Though I will say one last thing. I really wish the diaspora was a bit more, let's say, discerning. Right? I mean, I find that diaspora politics in South Asia is very undiscerning. I find it deeply troubling. And I'm a diaspora child. So I say that with insider knowledge, that I find it troubling. I find diaspora in this digitalized age is very important. And mind you, diaspora, when I say diaspora, it's very interesting, right? Because most of the South Asian diaspora is working class. But the outsized influence is of relatively more affluent segments. Look at all the diaspora. If you go to Dubai and you see how immigrant workers live, they live together. Indians, Pakistanis, Sri Lankans, Bangladeshis, they all live in like rooms not fit for animals, frankly speaking. And they're treated like subhumans. They don't have any narrow nationalism sort of eating away at their sensibilities there. So I'd say the sort of well-to-do diaspora, because we're sitting abroad and we're here, I think there's a lot of deepening of their own political ideas and consciousness that I think is certainly something to aim for if you want some kind of progressive. Because if the representations of Pakistan and India and Sri Lanka abroad are Modi and Imran Khan and Rajapaksa, then we got problems. We're going to continue having problems. And it's the NRIs and the overseas Pakistanis, and I'd suspect, I don't know enough, but maybe some of the overseas Sri Lankans who die hard supporters of these strong men. And that is certainly something to, in a separate time and space, something to talk about and something to research. How do these political ideas get shaped abroad? Why are they shaped this way? Is it purely the fact that they have interests, material interests, they want to send their money home and they want to have good investment outlets and they want to be able to make, to invest in real estate and the stock market? Could be. I think there's also a worldview. I think there's also a worldview at work here, which is worth thinking about. But I think that would be a big part of an alternative story, if there's an alternative set of ideas that are being talked about amongst the diaspora as well, and especially across. So if there's diaspora and South Asians who are talking about more, emphasizing we need to cooperate, we need to bring down our trade barriers, we need to have. It'd be great. We were talking about. It would be great if Pakistani students could go and study at JNU or go to the IITs. I mean, that would be awesome, as far as I'm concerned. I would love that to be able to expose my students to, and that changes your worldview. Because we grew up in Pakistan, and you think Hindus have like some kind of like scenes on their head. Literally, that's how kids grow up, because they're taught in the textbooks, you know, Gandhi was this and Nehru was this, and that's just breeds hate. And that you can only change that worldview if people come actually interact. They're like, you know, even though the same people who think that also watch Bollywood movies 24/7. So, you know, that contradictory, that dualism, right, where you can reconcile that with this hateful rhetoric. And I think that worldview, changing that, sort of redressing that is certainly something for the diaspora to think about.
Okay, thank you. Is there any more questions?
I think we should stop.
I think, yeah.
Before I get you all into trouble.
Thank you for a very, very interesting presentation, and I also like the way you've sort of put it in the broader context of what you say, newness and change, crisis of liberal politics, culturalism, demography, technology, digitalization. But yes, you know, Pakistan, very interesting position again, and look forward to seeing what happens once the elections are over, and how does the neutrality of the army, as you said, you know, play out. I didn't have time to ask my question, but that's okay. We'll probably catch up. But Punjab, a very, very important part of Pakistan, and you know, how does politics in Punjab? How would that impact the way forward? Given that now you do have the PNL air, you know, there, and I think that was also one of the issues played out between the army and Imran Khan. So, but for another time. So thank you all for coming, and we hope we can have some more of such events on Pakistan, and preferably joint collaborations between SASP, where I'm now, and ISS, where I was earlier. So thank you very much.